So the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra is finally here as Samsung's new flagship, and in this video we're going to compare it to the iPhone 14 Pro to answer the holy grail of age-old questions: which one should you buy, Samsung or Apple? So to kick things off, let's talk about the biggest difference between both the devices, which is the display. So the 14 Pro has a 6.1-inch XDR OLED display with a resolution of 1179 by 2556, making 460 pixels per inch, whereas the Ultra has a massive 6.8-inch Super AMOLED display, making a resolution of 1440 by 3088 and a pixel density of 501. Now both the devices come with always on display, and both of them have a refresh rate of 120Hz. Now the peak brightness is where the difference really lies, because the S23 Ultra has a peak brightness of 1750 nits, whereas the iPhone generally has 1000 nits, but Apple claims that if you're outdoors it can go all the way up to 2000, which is probably the brightest in any smartphone at the moment. So it really comes down to personal preference, because Samsung colors are always a bit more saturated and they're a bit better displays to look at, and as of late we are having a lot of issues with the iPhone 14 Pro displays burning. So S23 Ultra, in my opinion, takes the edge here. Now moving on, let's talk about the specs. The iPhone 14 Pro has the A16 Bionic with 6GB of RAM, whereas the Ultra has the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 with either 8 or 12GB of RAM depending on your storage. The iPhone 14 Pro has the 5-core Apple GPU, whereas the Ultra has a Adreno 740 GPU. The Ultra starts at 256GB and go all the way up to 1TB, and the iPhone 14 Pro starts at 128 but also goes all the way up to 1TB. Now the 14 Pro also comes with a 3200 mAh battery compared to the massive 5000 on the S23 Ultra. The 14 Pro has Face ID, whereas the Ultra comes with an under-display fingerprint scanner, and the Ultra also comes equipped with reverse wireless charging, which is something the iPhone 14 Pro misses out on. Now moving on, let's talk about something that's gonna blow you away, which is the cameras. So the iPhone 14 Pro was the first iPhone that jumped from a 12 megapixel to a 48 megapixel main wide sensor, but the S23 Ultra comes equipped with a 200 megapixel wide sensor, which is probably the highest resolution we have had in a smartphone till date. Now the 14 Pro has a 12 megapixel ultra wide sensor, the same as the S23 Ultra. The 14 Pro also has a 12 megapixel telephoto sensor, whereas the S23 Ultra has one 10 megapixel telephoto and one 10 megapixel periscope, which basically allows it to zoom all the way up to the moon. Now the 14 Pro comes equipped with a LiDAR sensor, which basically improves the AR capabilities and also allows for 3D scanning, which also is an amazing thing. But the biggest difference lies in video, where the 14 Pro can do 4K up to 60 FPS, but the S23 Ultra can do 8K up to 30 FPS and slow motion 720 all the way up to 960 compared to the 240 FPS at 1080p on the iPhone 14 Pro. But the iPhone 14 Pro can do ProRes HDR 10 plus video, whereas the S23 Ultra can only do HDR 10 plus. Now coming to the front, both the phones are exactly the same on paper, with a 12 megapixel sensor that can do 4K up to 60 FPS. All the real life performance for both front and rear cameras is very different, because on paper they might be similar, but as of late the processing and the image processing on the iPhone has been kind of strange, resulting in pictures that actually look worse than the iPhone 13 Pro. So hopefully that is something Apple resolves in future software updates, and something that allows it to bring closer to the S23 Ultra. Now moving on, the S23 Ultra comes in a host of new colors and starts at $1199, and the iPhone 14 Pro comes in space gray, silver, deep purple, gold, and starts at $999 for the smaller 6.1-inch and $1,099 for the 14 Pro Max. But which one should you buy? At the end of the day, it really comes down to personal preference and what you prefer. If you are an Android user and if you have that sort of Android ecosystem with an Android watch around you, obviously Samsung S23 Ultra is the way to go. But if you're someone who's already sort of surrounded by an Apple ecosystem, then obviously the 14 Pro is a better bet. But again, if you want to shake it up, the S23 Ultra on paper is an amazing and a really capable phone. And the 14 Pro, although it has this new dynamic display and a couple of new features, it's not that big of a step up, which again, the S23 Ultra isn't a big step up from the S22 Ultra, But both the phones are really amazing, and again, really comes down to personal preference. But if I was picking one, I would go with the S23 Ultra. But that is pretty much it. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Stay tuned for more content because a lot of new content is coming really soon. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Until then, please like, comment, and subscribe. Peace.